So welcome everybody, and this is going to be very informal, and this is the first time I've tried to do anything personally on Zoom except the participant who does nothing. So I'd like to start out by welcoming our speakers, Dr. Hall, Dr. Precious Hall from Truckee Meadows Community College, and our Attorney General Aaron Ford, who's with us. Thank you, both of you. And I'll start off with some bios. Dr. Hall is a native of Baltimore, Maryland, where she was educated in both the Baltimore County and Baltimore City public school systems. After graduating from Western Senior High School, the oldest public all-girls high school remaining in the United States, she attended High Point University in High Point, North Carolina, where she earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. After completing her undergraduate studies, she moved to Atlanta to pursue her graduate studies. Dr. Hall graduated from Georgia State University with both a Master of Arts degree and Doctor of Philosophy degree in Political Science, with concentrations in American government and politics, political behavior, and political theory. Currently, she is a race scholar who studies race, power, and privilege in a colorblind society. While keeping her eye on her educational pursuits, she's always made sure to find a way to be of service, and she believes this is a calling that we all must answer to for the progression of humanity. While working on her bachelor's degree, she served as class president and volunteered with Big Brothers and Big Sisters. As she completed her graduate studies, she served as president of the Black Graduate Student Association, later named the Majority Graduate Student Alliance, and as a volunteer with Habitat for Humanity. In 2012, Dr. Hall moved to Reno to join the faculty at Truckee Meadows Community College as professor of political science. Since being in Reno, she has worked with the Action Network, served on the board of Reno Bike Project, and has contributed to the development of food pantries on TMCC's campus and the development of the Faculty of Color Coalition. Dr. Hall firmly believes that to whom much is given, much is required. If she stands tall today, it is because she is standing on the shoulders of giants. Sorry. I promise I'm going to try not to do that anymore. And I'd like to introduce Nevada Attorney General Aaron Ford, who was sworn in as Nevada's 34th Attorney General in 2019 and is the first African American to take statewide constitutional office. Before his election, A.G. Ford served as Majority Leader of the Nevada State Senate. He previously served as the Minority Leader, Assistant Majority Whip, Chair of the Senate Committee on Natural Resources, Vice Chair of the Senate Committee on Education, and member of the Judiciary Committee. Before beginning his legal career, A.G. Ford served as a public school math teacher. He later attended law school and went on to clerk for the Honorable Denise Page Hood of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan, as well as the Honorable Johnny B. Rawlinson of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. He spent many years in private practice, including as a partner at Snell and Wilmer, LLP, and later as partner at Egglet Prince, both in Las Vegas. A.G. Ford earned his BA from Texas A&M University in Interdisciplinary Studies and then earned his MA in International Education from George Washington University. He also earned an MA in Educational Administration, as well as his law degree and PhD in Educational Administration from the Ohio State University. Welcome both A.G., if that's what we may address you as, A.G. Ford and Dr. Hall. And if you all would make a brief opening statement for us, that would be very much appreciated. And I was thinking 5 minutes maybe at most. Dr.
Hall.
Oh, okay, great.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for inviting me to come. I'm very happy to be here. This is something that had been planned pre-pandemic, and I'm glad that we are not letting the circumstances of the pandemic stop us from engaging in these even more important and critical conversations, given everything that has happened in our country the past few months and that continues to happen. So I definitely want to applaud you all because these are not easy conversations to have, but they are necessary conversations. We can't all just sort of go to our corners and try to figure these things out on our own. If we want to rise to a higher calling, if we want to really solve some of the underlying and pressing issues, we have to be able to open up and have that line of communication. So I hope that this is the first of many conversations that you all will be having, regardless of whether I'm a part of them or not, just to be able to help to move the conversation forward is just a privilege on my behalf. So first, I definitely want to thank you all for inviting me to be with you today. Um, I'm definitely happy about the format of what's going to be happening today because I believe that rather than talking at people, we have to engage in the questions, the answers to really have an understanding of what's going on. I just want to make sure that we understand that when we're talking about race and racism, we're not talking about one particular act. Racism is a systematic issue. It is the system of privileges and advantages that exist based on a person's race, which is a socio-political construct in the first place. And when I say socio-political, what I mean by that is we have ascribed in our country what it means to be white or what it means to be Black or Latino or Asian, etc. What it means to be Black in the US is not what it means to be Black in all of the countries around the world. Each country has its own political meaning and understanding. So we have to come to an understanding of what that means here. And in order to have an understanding, we have to know the history. So I know that will be part of our conversation today as well, knowing that we're not talking about one particular incident. Everything that we've seen sort of happening in our country over the past few months is not the beginning of racism in our country. It is a continuation of a system that we've seen continue to evolve under different umbrellas since the founding of this country, which is a whole different racist caveat in and of itself. So just continue to feel comfortable asking questions, continue to feel comfortable being uncomfortable, because we have to be willing to get into that uncomfortable space to really push the conversation forward. I also just want you all to just keep in mind that, and I'm going to speak a bit for the Attorney General here, we are not representatives of the entire race. We are members of the race who have our own experiences, have our own observations, but please, after this conversation today, don't leave thinking that we are the end all be all for topics of race and racism and how things have occurred. And that's one of the things oftentimes when we look at particularly those who may only have one or two friends or colleagues who belong to a particular race, we oftentimes will put the burden of on their shoulders of being the representative for that entire race. But we are certainly not. We are within the African American community. We have our own set of diversity that exists. So please keep in mind that we are not the sole representatives of what it means to be African American in our country. We bring to this conversation a wealth of knowledge, experience, and different perspectives, but please continue to feel that you should have conversations with different people within the community because we all have our own perspective. We are not a monolith group that only has one particular aspect or characteristic. We are a diversity amongst ourselves. So with that being said, I just want to again thank you all for having me here today, and I look forward to the questions, and I look forward to really engaging in these difficult conversations that are necessary.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. And Attorney General Ford, would you like to start?
Sure, sure. And I don't have to say much more. Dr. Hall essentially said it all. I mean, she's not joking when she says that we oftentimes, as African Americans who are accessible for a conversation, are viewed as the representative of the entirety of people who look like us. Let me say this: we recognize that, as Dr. Hall has highlighted. And fair burden or unfair burden, we recognize we carry it, notwithstanding the fact that it may be fair, or that it may be unfair. I have 3 sons and a nephew that I've raised, and if you ask any of them who they represent, they will give you the same answer. I guarantee it. The first thing they'll say is, I represent myself. If Aaron Ford messes up, they're gonna say, Aaron Ford, that's just a rascal. That dude, he's just no good, he's just a rascal. But the next thing they're gonna say, generally speaking, is, but you know what? That's just how all those Fords are. Every member of that Ford family, they're just good for nothing. I mean, look at their daddy, look at the brothers, look at the Ford family. So it becomes not just about Aaron and his actions, but a representation of Ford and the Ford family and our entire name. And then the next group we represent is, as Dr. Hall indicated, fair or unfair, is a lot of folks who will immediately jump to, but you know what? That's just how those Black people are. Black people are always the same way. They do this, they do that. This is how they represent, this is how they act. This is the stereotype that comes into play. This is when stereotypes come into play oftentimes, with the immediate extrapolation of one person's actions, Aaron Ford's, who happens to be Black, and whose last name is Ford. And suddenly we represent all of that. And I've learned through my travels, international travels, that the fourth group we represent, and my sons will tell you this, is don't be in France and act a fool, because suddenly that's just how all those Americans are. They're all arrogant, they're all exceptional, in quotes, you know, they think they run the world. So you represent more than just yourself, whether you want to or not. And that's just a burden that we all carry at some level, but absolutely as African Americans who are in the visible eye of others, if you will, and sometimes even when you're not, you suddenly become representative of the entirety of your race. And I've told my sons, as unfair as it may be, recognize that you do represent others. So always do your best. Always put your best foot forward. Always represent well, starting with yourself. There's a book that I used to read, and that my kids could also quote to you, and it's a book by the name of The Miseducation of the Negro. It's written by Carter G. Woodson, Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Hall would recognize his name. Many of you may recognize his name. Dr. Woodson is the second Black man to get his PhD from Harvard. The first Black man was a man named W.E.B. Du Bois, in case you didn't know. But Carter G. Woodson wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And in that book, I'm going to paraphrase a provision that I've lived by for a long time. He says that if you control the way a man thinks, you don't have to worry about the way he'll act. Listen to that for a second. If you control a man's thoughts, you don't have to worry about his actions. Now, he wrote this in the height of even higher racial tensions than we experience right now. And he was specifically talking about controlling a Black man's thought to make him think that he was shiftless, lazy, dishonorable, subhuman, and only was to be a servant or a follower and never a leader. And he said that we have to, that's miseducation. And I've been in the business of mind control for at least 27 years. That's the age of my oldest son, telling them that they're just the opposite. You can be whatever you want to be, do whatever you want to do, be as great as you want to be, again, recognizing you represent more than yourself. Carter G. Woodson says that if you make a man think he has to always come through the back, he's going to go to the back and look for a door. And if there's no door, he's going to dig a hole through the back wall so he can walk through it. Mind control. And what we have to recognize is that so many folks have consciously and subconsciously been brainwashed, have had their minds controlled relative to race-based interactions, racism, both subtle and overt, and conversations surrounding this, which is why I also want to applaud you for having this conversation, because it's not an easy one to have. Now, I don't know if Dr. Hall would go this far, but I'm gonna say this. I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable, nor am I trying to make you comfortable. Neither of those are my job. My job is to tell the truth and to speak the truth and to speak specifically from my perspective relative to what I've experienced, what I've seen others experience vicariously, what I've seen vicariously through others, and what I know. And you do with that what you will. What I endeavor to do is to move us from the realm of ignorance, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, because a lot of people just don't know. They've never been exposed to this type of conversation. They literally don't know, and that is a definition of ignorance, the non-pejorative definition. And so what I want, when someone offends me with something that is race-based, I will let them know what that is, because maybe they didn't know. And if they do it again, then I know what category I can place them in relative to my lineage of friends, right? It moves from being from ignorant to being intentional. And again, all that I do is speak the words that are true to me, and allow people to make their own decisions on how they want to proceed. And the last thing I'll say is this, which is again why I'm glad that you asked me to participate in this. I am the Attorney General. I am your Attorney General. I am the top law enforcement officer in the state. I'm a Black man as well. And this intersection gives me a prime opportunity to talk about some of the most pressing conversations that we're having right now related to policing in all communities, but predominantly for this conversation's purpose in the Black community. And so if I were to shy away from this conversation, it'd be a big waste of an opportunity. I'd be doing a disservice to actual history, both personal history and familial history, as it relates to race-based issues in this country. I'm not from Las Vegas. I got here as fast as I could, but I'm not from here. I'm originally from Dallas, Texas, which is in the South. Some folks want to call it the Southwest. I say it's more like Alabama than Albuquerque, so I call it the South. And I've experienced my fair share of racism, not just in the South, but also in what used to be called the Mississippi of the West, namely Las Vegas. And even there in Carson City, especially as an elected official, have I received my fair share, or some would say even an unfair share, of racial epithets strewn toward me in experiences. So again, the conversations are appropriate. I'm honored to be participating in this, and I'm glad you're having it. So let's talk truth.
Thank you, Attorney General. And we will take what you have to say and consider it yours and Dr. Hall's views, and try not to extrapolate it too far beyond that, but consider it informative. So I was hoping that you could, we could start with a couple of questions and then take some information, some from the folks participating, and then maybe a little, very little breakout session. But I wanted to ask, one speaker that I heard spoke about death by 1,000 paper cuts types of experience, and also racial microaggressions. And I think that's what you were talking about, Attorney General Ford. And either one of you can choose to address those however you'd like.
I will go first, but first, hi, Howard. Hadn't seen Howard since he retired from TMCC. And Howard was a great colleague, and him and I actually had several of these conversations while we had the privilege of working together at TMCC. So I'm happy to see you, and I'm glad retirement is treating you well. You look well. So happy to see you. I'm going to start with the death by 1,000 paper cuts, because I think that this really exemplifies what I mean when I say that racism is not one single act, but a systematic act. And what that essentially is saying is, you know, a paper cut is a small, little, tiny nick. It's not anything that draws a significant amount of blood. It's not anything that is fatal. It's not anything that's lethal. But if you have over 1,000 nicks in 1,000 places within your body in which you're losing blood, in which you are injured, that can potentially become fatal. So let's relate that to the system of racism that we see that has really exemplified itself today. It's not one particular thing that defines our racist society. It is a combination of things that have happened and have continued to happen that we see continuing to bubble to our surface today. So of course we know that when we look at the subjugation of African Americans, that existed at the very moment that this country was founded. African slaves were brought over at the same time that this country was discovered and taken from indigenous Native Americans. What we also know is that the history of slavery is one that was based on the thoughts and the mentality of the white individual being superior to those of African descent. But not only was it based on the thought mentality, there were deliberative acts that were portrayed to strip Native Africans from their native language, from their culture, from their spiritual and their religious beliefs, forbidding individuals who were from Africa from speaking in their native language, from speaking in their native tongue, forbidding individuals and separating whole and complete families. When we talk about, oftentimes one of the things that is portrayed in the media that we like to see and we like to talk about the brokenness of the families in the African American community, which one does exist, but we don't look at the many ways that historically this situation was created. This situation was proposed for a very good reason. As the Attorney General pointed out, if you can control the way one thinks, you're automatically going to control the way that they act. So when we see images today in the news of someone like a George Floyd who had the knee on his neck by the white police officer, that's a saying that we've had for years. Please take your knee off of my neck. Well, why is that? We've seen that happen both literally and figuratively, historically, to the African American community, where every time you try to rise or you try to raise up, you will see that there will be a ceiling that you knock against, a ceiling that you have to fight to get beyond. So the death by 1,000 paper cuts is simply just saying it's not one particular instance. It's not one particular example. It is the constant reiteration of the laws that have been put in place, the way that culture and society has viewed different individuals that continues to contribute to the system and the issues that we see today. People aren't born angry. People aren't born knowing how to hate. We are taught continuously and socialized into these things by the constant images that we see. Every time we see in the news an image of any person of color who is arrested, who is thought to be no good, characterized as a derelict in society, those are paper cuts to our overall image, which causes individuals who never meet people of color, who never interact, to automatically have these thoughts. So death by 1,000 paper cuts is saying it's not the big things that we should be paying attention to and reacting to. It's the small things along the way that we have to check to keep the system operating and functioning as it has. It's those small things that we have to point out. So when we talk about those people who are what we call the whistleblowers, or listening to the dog whistles that others don't recognize, they play important roles because those are the tiny paper cuts that lead to the fatal flaws and mistakes that we see happening in society today.
Dr. Hall, yet again, hit the nail on the head. And there's a lot there, and a lot of which I think bears reiteration, and I will endeavor to do it in my own words and hopefully in a way that will be helpful. And it goes back to something I said a little while ago about controlling thought processes, leading to meaning you control actions. Education has always been used to indoctrinate, always. Always. As a young kid, I was taught, and to this day, when I hear the song come on, I stand when I hear the national anthem being played. And I know that there's a little protest associated with that these days, but there was a thought that was instilled in my mind, and my action immediately followed suit. And that's entirely appropriate. You know, this conversation, as Dr. Hall indicated, may appear to be the beginning for some, but it is nowhere near the beginning. It's frankly not even the middle of a conversation. It should be a conversation that has concluded, and one where we have actions that have already been implemented that help to bring about true equality in our country. What am I talking about? You know, there was a tweet that a senator, a US senator, put out about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, where he was arguing with an editorialist who said that our country was based on racist ideals, founded on racist ideas. And I'm not saying that one way or the other, except that what I try to do is to look at actual documentation from time periods and discuss those relative to the question at hand. And this senator said that's not true. We were founded on the notion of all men being created equal, and you know, the theory behind that sounds great. But let me read to you a portion of the Dred Scott decision. And if you're not familiar with it, then I encourage you to take a look at it. The Dred Scott decision says that it is difficult at this day to realize the state of public opinion in relation to that unfortunate race which prevailed in the civilized and enlightened portions of the world at the time of the Declaration of Independence and when the Constitution of the United States was framed and adopted. But the public history of every European nation displays it in a manner too plain to be mistaken. It goes on to say that they had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations. And here's the catch. And so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This is a thought process that oftentimes has been instilled, not in as direct words as we've heard in the Dred Scott decision, but now in more subtle approaches, the paper cut approach that Dr. Hall is talking about. What am I talking about? Well, come here, campaigns of the 50s and the 40s and the 60s, where they say we can no longer say the N-word in context of our campaigns. So let's start using coded language that references the same thing, like welfare queens and suburbs being overrun by ghettos, and neighborhood integrity. Neighborhoods should be allowed to have racial integrity in the ways that they are set up. These became the new phraseologies of ways in which people could discriminate on the basis of race. And I'm not telling this to some of you who, some of you may already know this, may recognize this, and can probably nod your head as a recollection of how this transition takes place, which is the reason why, for example, and look, it's difficult to talk about this without talking about the political system, right? But I have to bring this up because I am in the news right now for having acknowledged it or brought it to the forefront. When I hear dog whistles, as Dr. Hall talks about them, I call them out. They're not talking to me per se, but I hear them and I recognize them because I'm a student of history and I know when they've been used before. And so when I hear the context of an argument that the outcome of an election needs to be challenged, that we need to be watching people at the polls very carefully, and I'm also hearing people say that certain groups should stand by. I know what that means. You want to know how I know what it means? Because my parents and my grandparents lived in the South, hearing the exact same type of verbiage coming out of people from on high, representing the government, sometimes participating themselves in the oppression and voter intimidation tactics. I know it when I hear it, and people argue against building straw men, as they say, that you can tear down. This ain't no straw man. This is a very real boogeyman. It's a very real man that has been experienced just a generation ago. I'm not talking about the 1800s now, from the Dred Scott decision. I'm talking about the 1960s. And now I'm talking about today. And so it's important that we continue to call these out, notwithstanding the fact that as the top law enforcement officer in the state, people will say that I'm abusing my position and that I shouldn't be talking about these things nonsense. If I don't, then it's a wasted opportunity to bring truth to the issue. It's not an issue for me to try to, again, make you feel uncomfortable or comfortable. Not my job. My job is to try to tell the truth and to try to protect folks exercising their franchise. In this instance, the franchise to vote. So, you know, it's these paper cuts, they hurt. And in fact, I'll be honest with you. Before I joined this call, I told my wife, I'm about to have this conversation again, and it's exhausting. This is an exhausting conversation. It is entirely exhausting. It hurts to have the conversation. It hurts to have to talk to my sons every single time we have another African-American male killed at the hands of police officers and they don't get in trouble for it. It hurts to have the talk. It's an exhausting conversation. It's part of my perpetual existence, though. And I've been conditioned to see things for what they are and to attempt to address them in the best way that I can. And one of the best ways to address it is, even though I'm tired of this conversation, I'm gonna keep having it. I will continue to accept the invitations that I receive from folks to engage in these conversations, again, so that we can move from ignorance to intentionality. So keep that in mind as you think about these microaggressions that you've asked about, Donna, and you think about these paper cuts. They are absolutely real. They do hurt. They are exhausting. But I suspect I can speak for Dr. Hall right now, remain undaunted when it comes to speaking to the issues, addressing them, and then suffering whatever consequence comes from those. And I say that in a political sense right now, because part of the threat that I receive from folks is, you're going to be a one-term AG, or, you know, you wait until we run against you. Listen, I got a family. And if the worst thing you're going to do is send me home with my wife and kids, you're doing me a favor. So it doesn't scare me to threaten me with running a candidate against me. It doesn't scare me to say that if you don't be quiet talking about this kind of stuff, you're going to be a one-termer. I know my time in this office is limited. I know my time in public service is limited. And that's why I'm going to take every opportunity that I can to continue to talk about these issues, because that's the only way we effectuate real positive change. So thank you so much.
And I'm just going to piggyback on one, just to give you an example, because I know sometimes individuals think that we might be saying things that maybe we haven't personally experienced. So I'm going to give you even a 21st century example. Attorney General Ford mentioned this concept of the welfare queen. So that was something that was propagated, as many of you would probably remember, through Ronald Reagan when he was president. That was something that was very much propagated. Now that was in the 80s. I moved to Reno in 2012, 21st century. And this was my welcome to Reno, which I didn't realize that Nevada was known as the Mississippi of the West until I came out here. But this was my first welcome to Reno. I just moved here and I went to my local Winco. And because literally I just moved here from Georgia, I had nothing in my house. So I had a cart full of groceries, you name anything you would think of to just fill your home and your refrigerator. I had a cart full of groceries. And I get to the checkout line and I had my debit card and I swiped my debit card and it got declined. And you know, I know that I have money, so I swipe it again and it gets declined again. And I say to the cashier, it's a young white woman. This is like day 2 for me in Reno. And I say to her, I think there's something wrong with the system. My card keeps getting declined. She looks at me, this is in 2012, and said to me, oh, I thought you were using a food stamp card and I had already put that in the system. What is it about me and my very being that the assumption was that I didn't have my own money to pay for these groceries? And when we talk about how subtle the system is, she didn't have to know that I had a PhD and I was a professor of political science to treat me with the human dignity to at least ask, ma'am, how are you going to pay for these groceries today? But the assumption was that because I was Black and I had a cart full of groceries, that I also fit into that category of a welfare queen, because that's what we see in the media and in society. And we are 40 years, almost 40 years past Ronald Reagan, but yet people still think that and they still assume that. But also think about my mental thought process at that time. I'm brand new to Nevada. I was single at the time, so I was here by myself. And I have to quickly decide, how am I going to handle this situation? I can't be upset with this young woman because I don't know the landscape here in Reno. I don't know if I'll become upset and they think that I'm irate and they'll call the police on me, and then all of a sudden it turns into a larger situation than because she made an assumption. These are the things that we constantly have to think of and we constantly have to weigh. But the reality is everybody reaches a point where sooner or later enough is enough. And as Fannie Lou Hamer said, you get sick and tired of being sick and tired. So these examples that Attorney Ford gave are not anything that's not relevant to today. And he mentioned the Dred Scott case, but I can take it even back further to our Constitution itself in 1787 that said that I only counted as 3/5 of a person. And not only for the purpose of having a vote, but for the purpose of just being counted for representation so that other people could have a voice and other people could have power. I was also in a constitution, in Article 4 of the Constitution, that talked about the fugitive slave, that said that even if I, as a slave who escaped the unjust practice of slavery, if I escaped and I found my freedom and was caught, I had to be returned back to slavery, which let me know in 1789 that I could never be free in America. I could never be free because even if I managed to get the courage to run away, if I managed to find the courage to find my way to a state that wasn't even practicing slavery, I had to be returned back to the same conditions. So we see that even though historically these are things that have happened, they still relate to how people think today. And then we as the individuals who face these things have to make decisions about how we're going to react. Now, fortunately, I had the ability to take a step back when I was in Winco and decide not to react to that situation. But I wasn't somebody like, let's say, a George Floyd, who literally my life was at stake and I couldn't breathe and I'm fighting against my natural instinct to fight back. When you can't breathe, your natural instinct is to do everything within your power to breathe. So then we are now subject to punishment for following what anybody else would do in the same situation. So Donna, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Hall, and thank you, Attorney General Ford. And I appreciate how hard it is to keep saying the same thing over and over and not being heard. And my hope is that some hearing happens and some dialogue happens today. So I'd like to accept, if people have questions now, I think it would be helpful to have some at this point. Does anyone, I guess I have a simple question. I'm unfamiliar with the dog whistle term. I sort of got the gist of it from your reports of those. Could either one of you clarify that?
Yeah, a dog whistle, again, it's perceived, it's called that because it's only certain people can hear it. It's coded language, in other words, right? A dog whistle, humans can't hear, but dogs can hear it. And under circumstances where they can no longer, this is at least as articulated in a book by E. Rainey, don't let me misstate, isn't it? The name of the book is Dog Whistle Politics. And in the book, he talks about the fact that the campaigns of the 70s and the 80s recognized that the 50s and the 60s campaigns wouldn't work, where they couldn't literally be out adamantly opposed to civil rights by using the N-word and things of that sort. So they had to find new coded language that essentially meant the same thing relative to segregation and separation and hierarchy of races. And so they used things like, again, when integration was attempted through the Affordable Housing Act or through equal housing opportunities, coded words like neighborhoods should be able to keep a racial, ethnic integrity. And so, for example, when I hear current politicians say that Cory Booker is going to destroy the suburbs through certain housing acts, it's reminiscent of the dog whistles of the 60s and the 70s, where people are saying the suburbs are where the white people live, and the urban areas are where the Black folks live. And if we have equal housing that goes out to the suburbs, then what we're doing is bringing Black folks in contact with white folks, and well, we really don't want that. So that's an example. That's a pretty simple example of what a dog whistle is. And again, looking at the context of the conversations that are taking place, as well as the messengers in some of these. Some people who have a history of speaking in sometimes overt racist language, but sometimes covert racist language. You have to be cognizant of it. And sometimes, you know, you could be wrong. I could be wrong in hearing a dog whistle that doesn't exist. I can acknowledge that. But generally speaking, I haven't been wrong. I kind of know what they're trying to do and what they're talking about. And so that's important to note. Now, I do want to say this before you go into questions. And like Dr. Hall, I'll give you a quick example. I've been a state senator before I was a attorney general, and we get specialized license plates. And I had one that said Senate District, whatever it was. This was a few years back. And I pull up in a restaurant, and a lot of people who've seen me in the public know that I used to wear bow ties all the time, suits and a bow tie. That was people kind of recognized me as the senator who wore bow ties all the time. I get out my truck that has Senate plates on it. I walk into the restaurant, and someone, as I'm walking in, says to me, because they see my Senate license plate that says senator or whatever, they say, "Who are you driving for?" As if I'm a chauffeur. As if I'm not the one getting out of the driver's side of my own vehicle. The presumption was this Black man dressed to the nines can't be the senator who owns this car. And that's one of those microaggressions. That's one of those paper cuts, if you will. It wasn't a dog whistle per se. That was straight out, you know, not acknowledging that, by the way, I got 5 degrees, including a PhD. And you could call me senator, but you could also call me doctor for it. But the assumption was that I was a chauffeur for the senator. And that's the type of experience that continues to this day. And now, I'm going to say something good because this is an important thing. I just tell the facts, right? I talked about Dred Scott. We've all heard about Brown v. Board, the one that integrated our public school system in the 1950s. But what a lot of people don't know about is Nevada has shown a penchant for being progressive at times. And in the 1800s, well, 70 some odd years before Brown v. Board, we had a case by the Nevada Supreme Court called Stoutmeyer. And in that case, a Black boy wanted to go to Carson City schools, by the way. I'm talking to Carson folks, wanted to go to Carson City schools, but he was Black. And the legislature had passed a law that says Black, Mongoloid, and Indians can't go to school with white folks. He sued, and our Supreme Court, our state Supreme Court in the 1800s, well, 70 some odd years before Brown v. Board, said that separate but equal is unconstitutional. We got rid of separate but equal in our state 70 years before the United States Supreme Court made that same determination. Now, that's important to note because we have demonstrated a capacity since 20 years after our founding to do what's right and to be equal and to treat each other with dignity and respect and to recognize that racism has no place in our battle-born Nevada. You know, and I don't have to only talk about race. We could talk about the fact that I have a majority of women on the screen right here, that your quote unquote right was recognized. By the way, I don't say right was granted to vote because you've always had the right to vote. It just hadn't been acknowledged. And so the acknowledgement of your right to vote in Nevada was well before the 1920s when the US Constitution was amended to allow for that same recognition to take place. So our state has demonstrated this capacity to be progressive and to be pro-equality. The experiences that Dr. Hall talks about in 2012, mine continue to happen in 2020, and so do hers. And so that doesn't say that you know, we are in a bad place. It does say that we still have work to do. And that's the purpose of these conversations that will continue, I think, until the work is done.
And I did want to point out as well, when we talk about the dog whistles, a big one that we saw started by Richard Nixon was this concept of law and order. Most people, when they hear law and order, you think, okay, yeah, great. We do want to live in a society that respects the laws and that promotes order. But that was a deliberate saying and tactic that was used by Richard Nixon, because like Attorney General Ford said, is that they realized quickly that we cannot run a campaign using the same terminology, the same language that we use in the 50s and 60s. So we're going to transform into the language of law and order, which means, of course, don't we want our streets to be clean? Don't we want criminals to be in jail? But if you look at the beginning of the terminology of the use law and order, and also study the fact that the prison population exploded exponentially since then, particularly for people of Black and brown skin, we see a direct correlation between this use of law and order. And also think about it today with the current individual occupying the White House, particularly if we think about what happened in the city of Portland. The term that was used by the president, we have to institute law and order. So we're going to send federal troops to break up the protests. Well, one thing we have to remember is that we do have a right to protest, peaceful protest in the First Amendment. And when certain people hear law and order, this is how sneaky the dog whistle is. It's also true that certain individuals will purposely make the protest violent in order to institute troops coming in to take people, to stop them, to physically harm them, to pull apart, to stop an individual's right to engage in their First Amendment civil liberty. So law and order is a big one that if anybody, I mean, we don't have time to get into the depths of it today, but if you just look it up and think about the foundings of that, think about how it got started and the things that happened after that, that's a big dog whistle saying that we hear our president saying today, that was started in the 70s, and that has very serious consequences to those who are actually thinking that that's a call to action for myself.
That's the best example yet of a dog whistle. And I'm glad you mentioned that, Dr. Hall, because if you recognize that Nixon used it in response to the civil rights movement being led by peaceful protests of Martin Luther King, but also against protests against Vietnam War. He used that phraseology during that time period. And a lot of you will remember this if you think back on it. Law and order, that was the phraseology being used to tamp down on things that look similar to what we're saying right now. And by the way, we don't have to make up this notion of, this isn't a conspiracy theory that people are infiltrating peaceful protests to bring in law and order opportunities, right? Look at the fact that during peaceful protests down in Las Vegas, Boogaloo Boys, which is a right-wing extremist organization, white supremacist organization, came down to Nevada, came down to Las Vegas during one of the protests with bombs, trying to blow up federal buildings in the midst of peaceful protests in order to make these protests into violent ones that led to destruction. They were caught, the FBI caught them, and these guys are being prosecuted right now. And I don't have to make this up any further, but take a look at in California. If you recall, during one of the conventions, there was a conversation about a Homeland Security officer, I believe it was, who was killed in California during some of these protests. What was not told to you was that it was a Boogaloo boy who killed that individual. So there are always these instances of folks coming in trying to co-opt peaceful protests. You should check I'm gonna be quiet right now, but you should check out my Twitter. You can go look at the media components. I put out a flyer, a political cartoon from the 1960s. And it has a picture of Martin Luther King on it. It's a drawn out cartoon with Martin Luther King on it, with a lot of what you can tell was violence and destruction that had just occurred, with the caption saying, "And tomorrow I'm leading another peaceful protest." And the reason why I shared that was to encourage those who are having peaceful protests today to continue doing that. Because right now, people argue that Martin Luther King is the standard that you should adhere to. That back then, they were also lumping him in with the folks co-opting his message. So recognize that for what it is too, and it's just a repeat again of what we've already seen. And I'm a student of history in this regard, which is the reason why I continue to call out dog whistles when I hear them, but also point out the hypocrisy of a lot of what's being said to this day.
Thank you both for answering that. That was really helpful, and it's helpful in understanding more about those protests, which you're right, start out as peaceful. So it sounds like we have at least one question. would you like to go first, Susan or Howard?
So we see some questions in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah, I see both Susan and Howard have asked a question related to law and order, and not knowing the dog whistles as them being dog whistles, which, by the way, is the point of this conversation, which is the reason why I continue to say out loud when I hear them what they are, so that people can become educated about them. So that said, one of the things that I was so pleased to see right in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing was, and I hate to say that in the same sentence, because who's pleased to see anything in the aftermath of someone's killing, right? But what didn't happen was the conflation of peaceful protest and violent protesters. That didn't happen. You saw the media, to your question, Howard, you saw the media distinguishing between peaceful protesters and looters. They didn't lump them together. Now, today, we're starting to hear people lumping them together because they're getting complacent and they are being distracted from, by sports and whatnot, and they're not paying as close attention to what's really going on. But what we have to do is to continue to be vigilant with our terminology and be vigilant with recognizing that people have the First Amendment right to peaceful protest, as Dr. Hall indicated. So acknowledge that that's taking place. You can do that, and at the same time, as I have done from the beginning, say, I'm advocating peaceful protest. Violent looters, you need to be prosecuted. And peaceful protesters, don't let them co-opt your message. You can do both at the same time. These are not mutually exclusive conversations, but you have to say them. And don't get lazy and conflate the two and make it appear as though what's happening in Portland in terms of violence and whatnot is the peaceful protesters. That's not the same thing. Call them out for who they are and let the law take them down the road they should be taken down, and leave alone the peaceful protesters and acknowledge that they have a right to do so. So anyway, that's my response to those questions.
Great clarification. Susan, did you get your question answered? I don't know if Susan is still with us. And Howard, how about you?
Yes, I did. It's just that when we talk about the media, and I tell everybody I'm an avid news whore. I've got the news all the way around, and it started off peaceful protests being separated. Now it's being lumped all together, and I'm curious, as Dr. Ford said, I have to, as a user of the media, apparently I have to go and say to Channel 2, you're lumping it together. You're not showing us examples of law and order. So it becomes something I have to take part in. And I think that we as Episcopalians have it in our history that we're supposed to stand up for justice. So if law and order is being used wrong and we're not standing up for it, we've given up part of our baptismal covenant. Thank you.
So we have to call the media out. Thank you.
Yeah,
That's
I'm just going to
helpful.
jump in. I'm going to jump in there as well and say a couple of things. One, when we talk about a system of checks and balances, it's not just government officials checking each other. We, the people, are responsible for checking the government. We, the people, are responsible for checking the media. And as Howard pointed out, if you are a consumer of the media and you notice these things, call them out and check on what they're doing so that they will stop. But one of the things that I always tell my students, and I tell everybody, we should never assume and never make the mistake of thinking that the primary function of the media is to inform us. The media is a business, meaning by a byproduct of what it does, we are able to get information. But the number one factor for the media is to make profit. And making profit and giving unbiased information do not go hand in hand. And oftentimes when I say unbiased information in the media making a profit, people think that I'm just talking about like a Fox News that often gets talked about. I'm talking about all of the media. So we use it to help us be informed, but we still have to do our own research. And in the 21st century, everything is at our fingertips. And there's no excuse for when you hear something, if you question it, to look it up yourself and just to see, is that in alignment with what historically and presently is happening? But never make the mistake in the assumption that the primary task of the media is to inform us so we can be knowledgeable citizens. We are informed as a byproduct of their overall mission, which is to make money.
That's an excellent reminder. I think we've got questions from Jeanette and also from Stuart. Jeanette, would you like to go first?
Sure. Jeanette Miller, I'm from Carson City, and Attorney General Ford and Dr. Hall, thank you very much for being here. My daughter has a coworker and a friend. My daughter's white, her friend is black, and they've had a lot of discussions. And she, the other day, she said to my daughter, they were both leaving for work, and she said to my daughter, you know, I have to think about being black when I walk out my front door. And my daughter said, what? What? She says, no, I have to think about being black and how I'm going to be through my day. And my daughter says, I don't think about being white. And it made me cry because I'm wondering, what can I do? Because I don't think about being white. It's just there. But it seems that the people that are black in my life, they have to think that way. And it makes my heart so sad that they should have to. So what do I do? What do I do to help? I'm not phrasing this well. Help make it so that as a black person, it's not that I mean, we take pride in who we are and all the parts of who we are, but that you don't have to walk out the front door and steel yourself and tell yourself you're black to face the world. And I can walk out and go, here I am. Am I making it? I'm sorry, it sounded good when I said it in my head before, but.
Yeah, you're making perfect sense.
Thank you.
You're making perfect sense. And it's a question that I've heard since I've been having these conversations for 30 years. It's real talk. There's a book written in 1997. I'm going to mangle the title, but it essentially says, why are all the black people sitting together in the cafeteria? And it's the question of the intersectionality between race and identity, and recognizing that as a black person, it's so funny. I mean, this is funny, not haha, but funny as in ironic, I guess, at some level. You know, I'm just going to be vulnerable with you real quickly. I have, and Dr. Hall, this may be the case for you, I don't know, but I have been, if not the only, certainly one of the only black people in almost every environment in which, subsequent to high school. I went from inner city Dallas, Texas to Texas A&M University, 42,000 students, 700 of us, if I recall correctly, were black. And our classrooms were humongous, and I was one of the only, if not the only, black person in my classroom. I went from there to George Washington, from there to the Ohio State University, the only black person at my big law firms, representing, again, as Dr. Hall said, representing my entire race, whether I wanted to or not. And if we were lucky enough to have 2 or 3 folks who were hired, who were black, and we happened to be sitting together, we would always get looks and stares as people walk through and saw us talking together, whispers and wondering, what are they doing? Are they conspiring? I mean, what's going on, right? That's an existence that I've lived my entire adult life. And wondering and being cautious about that. White people have never had to worry about that. No. If I walk into a room of all white folks, they're all talking together and none of them are asking the question, what's going to happen when people see me talking to all these white folks? And I'm using this kind of tongue in cheek as the example of absolutely, it makes perfect sense, Jeanette. And it's part and parcel of, again, being indoctrinated through education, not always negatively, but obviously through education and through actions. Here's what you can do. And this was not an answer that I could come up with when I was asked right after George Floyd was killed. I got a lot of people suddenly texting me, calling me allies. They want to know what they can do to help pursue racial justice and police reform. And I got all of those calls. This, again, which is why it's very traumatic for us. And I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just telling you, recognize that it is a difficult time for us as well. And I could think of the right answer, but here's the answer, Jeanette. I'm gonna tell you this. Be an ally and speak on these issues when the fervor has died down. Be around when inevitably people start conflating, as I've indicated, peaceful protesters with violent rioters. They're not the same thing. Be around and speak out when you see the media conflating these issues or not speaking truth to power, or when the media uses law and order without giving an explanation. Be around and speak up when you hear instances of discrimination taking place. You're hearing jokes. Jeanette, you get to go places I will never be. And that's just how it is. And you're going to be in circles in which I will never be. And that's just how it is. And under those circumstances, you have a power and an ability to effectuate change at a level that I will never be able to do it. You will have conversations that I can't have and won't have with folks. And you should use those to progress racial equality, knowing the stuff that you know. And so hopefully that's somewhat helpful. It's kind of amorphous, but at the same time, I think it's a pretty direct response. You speak out when you can and represent when you can, call it out when it is, and just highlight it and recognize that that's one way in which we get to change thought processes and therefore actions of folks. And I'm going to tender the mic back to Dr. Hall and whomever else, but I do want to respond to a question in the chat about whether we know if the organization Black Lives Matter is responsible for any of the violence currently taking place. The answer is, of course, there are people in every organization out there who are likely co-opting peaceful opportunities. Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree that you might have some folks who are representing an organization, whether it's Black Lives Matter, the Boogaloo Boys, someone who's a me, i.e. not associated with any organization, who's doing stuff they shouldn't be doing. But at the same time, it goes back to me saying, who do you represent? It is unfair under these circumstances to say that because an individual from Black Lives Matter may have engaged in something that was inappropriate, that the entirety of the organization should be saddled with that particular blame, especially when, as we know, there are some folks who are put into organizations to infiltrate, to claim as though they are Black Lives Matter affiliates, and to do stuff just so it can be said that Black Lives Matter is the perpetrator of this violence. And I've given you examples of that. Black Lives Matter just isn't Black folks. There are a lot of folks out there who are walking in the streets right now, arm in arm with folks who believe that, in fact, Black Lives Matter. And some of those folks are Boogaloo Boys, claiming to be Black Lives Matter affiliates. I'm just gonna give you an example. I'm not saying this is widespread, but you can't, this goes to the issue of what I said earlier about extrapolating one person's actions to the entirety of an organization. It's unfair and it shouldn't be done. And you should be cognizant about that, Jeanette, when you are talking about these issues with other folks as well, when they purport to try to say this organization in and of itself is the problem that we're seeing in the streets.
Thank you. I really appreciate that response. Yes, go ahead, Dr. Hall.
I would piggyback as well, Jeanette, when you say, what can be done? I think one of the things that's going to be important is to have these conversations with your friends, acknowledging your privilege. So often when we talk about the concept of white privilege, one of the major pushbacks that you will hear is, well, I'm white and I worked for everything that I've had, and I've never been privileged a day in my life. And when we say that white privilege exists, it's not to say that individuals who are white or anybody doesn't work hard for what they have, but it is to acknowledge that because of the way that the system in our country functions, there is a level of privilege that comes along with being white. And Jeanette, as you pointed out, one of the biggest factors is I don't have to think about being white when I walk out of my door. That is a privilege that exists. And I think you having these conversations with your family and your friends so that people can acknowledge, well, yeah, you know, there is a such thing as just by virtue of being white, I don't think on this the same way as others, or I don't have to have those same considerations. That helps to push the conversation forward, because we can't ever fix what we refuse to acknowledge. And if we refuse to acknowledge that this privilege does exist for certain groups, we'll just continue to be really where we are now. And I'll give you an example of how, you know, different ways that we think of, well, what does it mean to be Black in society? So my husband, he actually moved to Reno about 2.5 years ago. And just regular everyday life things. Recently, he was having, you know, some back pain. And we were introduced to these, you know, they now have these massage guns, you know, shaped like a gun that have different attachments. You can do different therapies on someone's back. And he, you know, he was saying, you know, I think we should try this, we should get this. And we did get it. But one of the conversations that him and I had was, okay, we live in an apartment. And, you know, not that we're close, but somebody that lives across the street, if we have our blinds open, can see what we're doing. One of the things that I said to him was, if I'm ever using this massage gun on you, we have to close the blinds. And he goes, well, why? I said, because think of somebody across the street seeing me, a Black woman with a gun-like figure pointed to your back. We live in a situation where we just had an individual like Breonna Taylor sitting in her own apartment, doing nothing, minding her business, and the police came in and shot and killed her. What more would they do to us because they assume that I have a gun and we are two Black people that have guns and are going to harm each other? Those are the things that represent what it means to be Black in America, and how we have to, with something as simple as getting a machine that massages you to relieve back pain. Does this look too much like a gun? Does this resemble too much like somebody might call the police and we might be harmed for something innocent? Those are the things when we say white privilege. White privilege doesn't mean you've been given every single thing that you have and you haven't worked hard for what you have. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that even though you work hard for what you have, there is still a level of privilege that exists that we need people to acknowledge, because that's one of the first steps to fixing the problem.
Thank you. And we have a second question, but Stuart, did you want to respond to your statement question?
Sure. I hope my internet stays stable during this. Dr. Ford and Dr. Hall, thank you for your work in all of this and for your willingness to put yourself out there and talk to us today. I appreciate it. I was recently reading Jesus and the Disinherited, and I sort of had this moment where the scales dropped from my eyes when I heard the line about how white people are basically deputies of the social construct in this country. And so my question is just simple. How do we as white people undeputize ourselves and work towards a way for racial reconciliation?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think it's, you know, in my estimation, pretty similar to what Jeanette has asked about ways in which you can kind of help and engage in this. Now, let me be clear, and that there is a limitation that words have in this circumstance. I'm gonna acknowledge that right now. I don't think it's required that we not acknowledge who we are and our backgrounds. That is not required. I'm a Black man. My heritage is 35% Nigerian. It is, you know, 11% from Benin and Togo. It is 11% Jewish. You know, I have a background, and there is nothing wrong with me acknowledging and being proud of that background. And you, Stuart, I'm certain you are you know, able to track back where your ancestors come from. There's nothing wrong with that acknowledgement. It is obviously the hierarchy that you've addressed in your question, I think, that can sometimes present, not can sometimes, that will, generally speaking, present the problem. So in my estimation, the thing to do is to recognize people as who they are and as they identify without judgment, right? Without the hierarchy that we're talking about here. That said, we have to recognize where we are right now is based on 400 years, you know, and that, you know, I remember I used to work at, one of my first real jobs was at Burger King. And I had a boss there who used to let us take 15-minute breaks because that's what the law was. And some of my people used to go take breaks and they would smoke. And they would come back in smelling like smoke. And my boss would say to me, you should never do that, Ford. Aaron, you should never go out and start smoking. And I was like, okay, I won't, but tell me why you're saying that. And he was like, because it takes 3 days to make a habit and it takes 7 days to make a habit and 21 days to break it. That's what he said. 7 days to make a habit, 21 days to break it. 3 times as long to break a bad habit is what he said. And I have construed that in my mind in this conversation to recognize that we've had hundreds upon hundreds of years of race-based bad habits. And it's not going to change in one generation. The Civil Rights Act of 1965 ain't going to cure it all in my generation. It's just not going to happen. It moves us toward it, but we're talking about hundreds upon hundreds of years of, again, thought processes being controlled by social interactions and whatnot. So it's going to take concerted, direct effort to recognize it, as we've heard Jeanette talk about, to speak to it as we are suggesting that you do, call it out, be cognizant, self-reflect on it, figure out ways in which you can, because I don't have all those answers to it, but those are the suggestions that we make. And I think that's how you, to use your phrase, de-deputize yourself when it comes to those things. So hopefully that's a helpful kind of soliloquy of sorts. But you know, if not, I'm sorry, but that's all I got right now.
I'll jump in there, and I've actually read Jesus and the Disinherited, and it was a very powerful read for me the first time I read it, probably about 9 or 10 years ago. And one of the most powerful parts to me was actually towards the end in his summation. And I'm going to paraphrase here because I haven't read the book in a while, but one of the things he says is, you must abandon your fear of each other and fear only God. He also says, let your words be yay or nay. Anything else is evil. And one of the things that I think that we've fallen into the trap of is trying to be politically correct, or saying, well, yeah, but there's, you know, shades of gray, and, you know, both sides have a valid point. But one of the things I think Howard Thurman was getting to is there are just some things where there are no shades of gray. It's either yes or no, it's right or it's wrong. And I'll go back to the example of like George Floyd, and even take it back to Trayvon Martin a few years ago. Well, he looked suspicious. Well, since when does somebody looking suspicious mean that you have a right to take their life? There's no shade of gray there. That's no. In a situation like George Floyd, well, he had his knee on his neck because there's, you know, we don't even have the final reports, but he might have been high or he was a known criminal. But since when does being a known criminal or you having drugs in your system lead to you being killed at the hands of the police? Yay or nay? Let's stop excusing the behavior, because we have fallen into a situation where we allow one group to be judge, jury, and executioner. And that's not how the system functions. That's not how the system works. So I think one of the ways that we undeputize ourselves is by saying there are just some situations where it's either yes or no, right or wrong. There are no shades of gray, and there's no excusing the situation. I think some of the most powerful images we've seen of late have been those situations where you have the protesters coming face to face with the line of police, and the police taking a knee as well. Think about how powerful it would be if, while individuals who were protesting were surrounded on the perimeter by our white allies, letting them know, we may not know exactly how you feel or exactly what you're going through, but we know that things are right or things are wrong, and we're going to be in this fight with you. We're going to help to protect you. So going along with that reading, being comfortable with saying yes or no, because there's not every situation where there are shades of gray. Even when we think about the situation of the gentleman in Wisconsin, his name is slipping me, being shot 7 times in his back. Well, we don't even know the full story, but there was a domestic violence dispute, or we thought that he was going to kidnap a little child. Since when is it ever acceptable that you have a perpetrator, you have your hands on a perpetrator, and you shoot them 7 times in the back? That's the only way that you can think of to de-escalate the situation. And again, I think people think that when we point to the actions that, oh, we're excusing, well, this person committed a crime or this person was doing something wrong. It doesn't excuse that. It says that we have a justice system that's supposed to work for everyone, but we see that the justice system is not being equated in this, is not being applied in the same way. So having those yes and no's, right and wrongs, coming out and saying that helps with the situation. A prime example, since when, I mean, we had a presidential debate in which the president of the United States told, I call them the little Proud Boys, to stand by. Since when is that ever acceptable for us as a country or a society, that the leader of the free world, the president of the United States, on national TV, and some people say it's a dog whistle. I can't even say that was a dog whistle. That was a flat out bullhorn. Yeah. That you get on national TV and say stand by, that's wrong. That's wrong. Well, he doesn't really mean it, or no, you mean what you're saying, you know, when you have a platform. So being comfortable with the uncomfortable aspect of having to say yes or no, I think goes and plays a part into that.
Thank you both for your responses. We had a question, and we got into a little bit of it. 2 topics that I thought were maybe too big for today's time, and I see we're pushing kind of close to an hour and a half, and I truly don't want to totally exhaust Dr. Hall and Attorney General Ford, but the 2 topics that, gosh, would be wonderful to discuss at a future time, and maybe now, if you know, it's up to you all, how to re-envision police response and police forces. And the other one that Charlotte, you raised, is about reparations. And that's, I think, a really large topic. But I'll let you both speak to either one of those or both of them, and choose whether or not we dig into those. And then I know, Susan, you had a question that I'd like to get to before we're done. So Attorney General Ford and or Dr. Hall.
Yeah, so I also want to just real quickly respond to the question. I think someone, is it, okay, I think this was Susan said, I mean, is it wrong or bad to have white privilege? Should I be sorry? I think we've addressed that at some level. I just want to remind you what I said early on. I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable. That's not my job. My job isn't to make you comfortable either. It's just to tell you the truth, right? An acknowledgement of privilege, as Dr. Hall has eloquently laid out, I think is what's appropriate here. Let me give you an example of the issue with that, right? Our president was asked if he believed systemic racism existed. He said he did. He believes that systemic racism exists and has existed. He just doesn't acknowledge or believe that he has had the privilege of benefiting from it. And that, to me, I think it belies the actual existence and the reason even for it existing. And so again, no, I'm not telling you to be sorry for having a privilege, or to just recognize that it's there and help to try to equal the playing field through these types of conversations that we're having right now. You're right, though, about the reparations conversation. It's a much larger one that I think I have time to get into right now. But I will take a stab at a conversation on the reimagining policing conversation. In the immediate aftermath of George Floyd, I got on the horn with several folks, including law enforcement, North and South and rural. And I had a series that's called the Justice and Injustice Forum. And in fact, you should be on the lookout. That's going to be amplified on some of our cable stations pretty soon. And in the meantime, you can go to the AG's YouTube page if you want to, and you can look at those. They're about an hour each. I had 5 of them. The first one was the weekend after the George Floyd killing, and I had Sheriffs Lombardo, Balaam, the NAACP, a member of the clergy, and one other escapes me right now on that first panel. Subsequent panels had members of police officers unions, i.e. the rank and file. I had social-based organizations that were involved in the conversation as well. All in all, I had 5, and I intend to have 2 more subsequent to all of this when I can have some time to deal with the other component of the criminal justice system, the other components, which include prosecutors and public defenders, to have them have a conversation about how discretion to charge in the first place, which cops have, the discretion to arrest in the first place, which cops have, coupled with the discretion to charge in the second place, which is what prosecutors have. And thirdly, recognizing the discretion to penalize that judges have, being another part of the conversation as well. This is systemic, as Dr. Hall has indicated, and it's not just one system that's engaged or involved. This system, the criminal justice system, needs to be looked at from not only a policy perspective, and we have policies in place, by the way. A lot of stuff we talk about, they exist in policy right now. The duty to intervene, for example. If one cop sees another cop violating someone's human rights or constitutional rights, they're already supposed to intervene under policies in certain jurisdictions. They just don't do it. And then when they don't do it, there's no punishment for it. And so it's not the existence of policies, it's the enforcement of those policies. And not only the enforcement, but the transparency of the enforcement of those policies is something that's lacking right now. And so these are the types of conversations that are underway right now. But again, the time for conversing should be over, at least nearly over, if not completely over by now. That said, they're not. And so what we're looking to do next legislative session is to pass a handful of bills that address some of these issues. I will have 3 I'm working on. They touch on some of the issues that led to Breonna Taylor's killing in Kentucky. They touch on additional oversight that my office might be able to be given relative to officer-involved use of force claims, not necessarily all of those that end in death, but also use of force that ends in substantial bodily harm. And then also being able to investigate claims that departments themselves have racist practices and policies, not just racist, but discriminatory policies. Because by the way, this isn't, I know we're talking about race today, but discrimination isn't just about race. We talked about some women-based discrimination earlier. And the truth is there are police departments out there that I've already gotten reports on that have gender discrimination going on in place. And so looking at the ability for my office to have the ability to investigate departments at a policy and practice level, a pattern and practice level is part of what we can be doing to reimagine at least accountability and transparency in some of these issues.
So I know we only have a few minutes, so I'll try to just say a few things and not go too deep. I do want to address what Susan said. So, you know, should I not want to be white? God made me my color. I just don't understand. There's a couple things I want you to consider. God made you who you are, just like he made me who I am. He made us different, but it doesn't mean that he made us unequal. One of the things that we have to remember is, yes, God made all of us, but ascribing a meaning to race is not God made. That is a human thing that needs to be corrected. So God created white, he created black, he created Asian, he created everybody on this planet, but the meaning of what these races mean is not anything that is ordained or given by God. And I'm not a preacher, I'm not a minister by any means, but I have read the Bible for myself, and the Bible that I read tells me that the Lord requires us to do 3 things. That is to love justice, to love mercy and kindness, and to walk humbly with him. And you have to ask yourself, if I have this privilege, Am I living in these three things? And if not, what can I do to be in alignment with justice, mercy, and walking humbly with him? So I do want to address that. It's not to be ashamed of who you are. It's not to be ashamed of the things that make you who you are, but it is to understand that even though God created all of us, he did not create this meaning of what it means to be white, black, et cetera, et cetera. Humans made that. That's the first thing.
Well, I totally, and if I can interrupt, I totally understand that, and I'm not ashamed of who I am. I certainly don't want to walk around and, oh, I have white privilege. You know, I'm not going to do that either. I have empathy, sympathy, whatever you want to call it. I'm horrible. I'm naive. I'm horrible at this kind of stuff. But I know that God, you know, I mean, Jesus came and said to love your Lord God with all your body, mind, and spirit, and your neighbor as yourself. I have a hard time with whites and blacks of not doing that, and of always bringing up the past or holding somebody over, you know, because I'm white and you're unprivileged or whatever. I really have a hard time with of just bringing up always the past of, you know, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to say it. I don't understand. I have mixed emotions on a whole lot of it, but I do. I don't want to see color. I want to just see people, and I love people. And I guess I get frustrated with both races, all races, that why do we have to be separate? Yes, God made us different, but I don't understand the separate. We keep talking about the separation, and I think that causes separation. And what I have a hard time with is, I mean, it seems so stupid to say, why can't we just all get along? But it seems like the more we bring up the past and the law, the more strife it causes. And
I'd be really happy to.
I'm sorry.
Anytime. No, it's okay. We're just getting close to the end.
Okay.
I would be delighted to listen and have a conversation with you anytime. And
Oh, so Donna, I mean, yeah, thank you
Yes.
for respecting my time, and that's great. I'd love to be able to offer a response to what Susan has said, and I think Dr. Hall wants to too. I could tell she was getting ready to speak.
go for it.
So, I mean, to the extent you will indulge us the ability to go a little bit beyond noon,
You can absolutely go beyond. I'm just looking out for your interests. I
Yeah.
hope.
So, Dr. Hall, I saw you.
I was just going to point out that one of the reasons we have to talk about the past is because we still haven't truly acknowledged everything that has happened and that continues to happen. We are very much a nation that likes to sweep things under the rug, but all that happens is once you lift up the rug, you start to realize we never dealt with things. And this is going to tie into, I'm not going to touch deeply on reparations, but I'm going to touch on it a little bit. We talk about this concept of reparations and how it creates a lot of confusion amongst people. But one of the things that we have to look at is historically, how has reparations or advantages been given to groups that have led to the economic disparities that exist today? So one of the things that I would like for you all to do in your downtime is look at the history of land grants in our country, particularly after the Civil War. When the Civil War ended and the South lost, and those individuals who were just so adamant against losing in the South and adamant against the 13th Amendment and how they moved further west and how the government gave land to these individuals, taught them how to farm the land, taught them how to till the land, gave them land grants for universities for them to teach them, their children, and their community how to exist on the land and to subsidize themselves through that. That's one of the biggest examples that we can see of the economic disparities that lead to where we are today. In addition, consider the fact when we talk about the history and why can't we all get along? Well, we can't all get along until we acknowledge that there have systematically been things that have been done to keep us separate. Things such as redlining, banks refusing to give loans, housing loans to people of color to live in certain areas, as Aaron Ford said earlier, to keep the ethnic integrity of those areas. The government deliberately creating what we refer to today as ghettos to deliberately keep people of color in areas where today there's no access to fresh food and vegetables. There's no access to banking and lending institutions. So when we why can't we not talk about race? Because it matters. And you can even link it to things that's going on with the pandemic today. There's a reason why the pandemic is more fatal to groups of Black and brown people that has nothing to do with virtue of them being Black and brown. That has to do with the systematic things that have continued to happen that have put them in a place where they cannot sustain themselves through this particular type of virus. And believe you me, we've not seen the end of the effect of this pandemic on us as a society. The situation will only get worse when we talk about the separation economically. That's all I'm gonna say about reparations, but do your research and look at those land grants that were given particularly directly after the Civil War and the history of redlining that has existed in our country. So I do want to say that, and then I know we're at 12, but one of the final things I'm just going to kind of say is this. You know, oftentimes people will say, or you hear to say, well, if you don't like America that much, just leave, or anybody who doesn't want to, you know, stand up for the national anthem should leave the country. I want you to consider it this way, and this also is in the Bible. You know, I don't know exactly where, but it does say, you know, whom the Lord loveth, he chastiseth. We have to call these things to the public attention, and we do it out of love for where we are. This is our home, just like it's your home. For us, it's not, okay, well, go back to Africa and find your roots and find your family. Well, Africa is a part of our roots, but so is America. That is the definition of what it means to be African American. And just because we may point out the flaws of the country doesn't mean we hate the country. It means that we love the country and we believe that we can rise to a higher calling. If you have a child and your child is playing with a knife, you love that child, so you're going to stop them from playing with something that's going to be potentially harmful. It doesn't mean you don't love them, you want to take away their fun, or you want to make their lives miserable. It means that you want to protect them in their safety so that they can have a long and healthy life. This is the same concept. We point out the flaws and we point out that, and this is just one area. There's several areas to be discussed and to talk about so that we can rise to a higher calling and we can do better as a nation, because we're not asking for anything that wasn't written in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. When the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were written, it didn't necessarily apply to all people, but those words are what they are. So we're not asking for anything that's not already written in and woven into the fabric of our country.
Once again, she hit the nail on the head, and I won't offer much more except maybe an analogy, Susan. I hear you, right? I mean, who likes to talk about a hurtful past? Those things hurt. No one really wants to talk about that stuff. But let me ask you a question. When you go to the doctor, Susan, you fill out a form that asks for all your medical history, so there can be an appropriate and proper diagnosis of the problem. And not only that, but a prescription to help heal you going forward. You don't just go in and say, I have a headache, and then he just automatically prescribes you something with not knowing what might have caused the headache. Because in fact, it might exacerbate your headache if he doesn't consider the fact that you've had aneurysms. And I'm making up something, I don't know, I'm not a doctor, but the point is, we do have to examine the past to recognize how it has impacted where we are right now. And that does not mean, as Dr. Hall has indicated, that we are living in the past or that we hate our country because we bring up the past. We are recognizing fact, truth. Again, it's not about making you uncomfortable or making you comfortable. It's about telling the truth and recognizing that in the Dred Scott decision, it said point blank, there is not one right that the white man is bound to respect the black folks. And laws were created based on that belief, leading all the way up into till today. There are books, just last session, Susan, in Reno, there was a law on the books that was called a restrictive covenants that would not allow people to sell homes in certain neighborhoods to Black folks. It was a law still on the books. That law was struck down decades ago, but it was still on the books. And Senator Dallas Harris, a gay legislator, my senator, sponsored a bill that helped to remove that from current legislative books. So those things still exist, and those laws were put into effect based on philosophies of separate but equal, discrimination, whatever the case may be, and recognizing that is what led to what, as Dr. Hall indicated, redlining, the disallowance of banks in certain neighborhoods, of Blacks being able to move here and there. And let me tell you, Susan, the reason why I bring up the past is because I see the past replicating itself right now with some of the verbiage being used. When a person from on high says that Cory Booker, a Black senator from New Jersey, will destroy the suburbs by enacting policies that require affordable housing, that is reminiscent of racist past and verbiage that was used just a generation ago. So we have to recognize and remember that the past has led to where we are, and that if we're not careful, we will continue to replicate that. So you know that's my response to your statement there. It's not, again.
And I agree with you on the past.
Yeah. So
I agree.
there you have it.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Burning questions? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Hall and Attorney General Ford. I know this is exhausting, and I'm sorry in a way, only in a way, that we're having to do this again and yet and continue, but we'll probably do more. And I so appreciate your willingness to take part of your Sunday morning to do that. Thank you. And thank you all. It was a great discussion and great questions, and for your curious minds. And let's hope we do this, continue this dialogue. I think it's great.
Thank you, Donna.
Donna, I want to thank you for pulling this and pulling us together for this conversation. Thank you.
My pleasure. Yes. And
Thanks, everybody. Y'all have a great Sunday and have a great week.
I have
Thank
one question before
you.
people take off.
Okay.
Not a question, but more a suggestion. Those of us in the parish who are participating, it's important to share it with other members in the parish who weren't able to be here today or who chose not to. If you learned something that was helpful, please pass it around.